Okay, so dopamine. We could talk about dopamine for a very, very long time. And again, in the drugs class, in the psychopharmacology class, that's a huge, area of discussion and investigation because, dopamine is associated, right, with sort of motivated behavior. And that's certainly an issue involved in sort of drug use disorders, but also in any kind of motivated behavior. You're like, why are you watching this video, right? Hopefully there's some novelty here, which is one of the one of the aspects that helps to provoke the release of dopamine and encourage sort of engagement. Another major sort of behavioral kind of association with dopamine release is movement, right? And they tend to go along hand in hand, right? You tend to move when you're motivated, right? So dopamine is a modulatory neurotransmitter. It is a classical neurotransmitter. It's also was discovered early. It is a monoamine neurotransmitter. That means it's synthesized from one of the amino acids. It's actually synthesized from the amino acid tyrosine, which has a very specific sort of ring-like structure called a catechol ring. And so it's also called a catecholamine. So the catecholamines are a subset of the monoamine neurotransmitters. The other catecholamine, which is also synthesized from tyrosine, in fact, it's synthesized from dopamine, is the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. So the synthesis is a two-step process. So in a dopaminergic cell, and again, neurons that are going to release dopamine as their primary neurotransmitter are called dopaminergic neurons. The abbreviation for the neurotransmitter dopamine is a capital D, capital A, so DA. But in dopaminergic neurons, there are genes expressed for the synthesizing enzymes to take tyrosine, the amino acid, down to dopamine, the actual neurotransmitter. So the two synthesizing enzymes, the first one is one called tyrosine hydroxylase, which is often abbreviated capital T, capital H. Tyrosine hydroxylase grabs tyrosine and then converts it into this intermediate product. It's called L-dihydroxyphenylalanine, or the more common designation is L-Dopa. So L-Dopa is synthesized from tyrosine by the synthesizing enzyme tyrosine hydroxylase, or TH. Now the L-Dopa is next grabbed onto by another synthesizing enzyme. This is the second enzyme in this two-step synthesis process. It's called Dopa Decarboxylase. And Dopa Decarboxylase grabs the L-Dopa and converts it into dopamine. So there is a two-step synthesis process in neurons that release dopamine as their primary neurotransmitters. It involves tyrosine hydroxylase, which grabs the tyrosine and converts it into L-Dopa, and then Dopa decarboxylase, which grabs the L-Dopa and converts it into dopamine. So again, dopamine is critical for both movement and motivation. And in the brain, there are two sort of primary sources for, dopamine. The first is a nucleus that's located in the brainstem called the substantia nigra, which means the black substance. And actually, if you cut across the midbrain, you actually see these kind of looks like mustaches that kind of arc out, and they stain black. And that's the location of the cell bodies, for projections, for axonal projections that then work their way forward into other portions of the brain. So the targets of the substantia nigra, the nucleus in the brainstem that is a dopaminergic nucleus, are actually components of what we call the basal ganglia. And, I apologize for the term. We're going to go into the basal ganglia in more detail soon. But, the basal ganglia are a set of subcortical nuclei, that actually all interconnect with each other and all interconnect via the thalamus with the cortex. And they're critically important for the sort of timing of movement, the initiation of movements, the starting of movements, and the stopping of movements. And actually, really interestingly, we've learned also the initiation and the starting of and the timing of thoughts. The basal ganglia are fascinating, and we'll talk about them, in more detail soon. But the basal ganglia are actually called the basal ganglia because they were identified early before we, decided on, more precise nomenclature. Saying that, subcortical gray matter, clumps were actually called nuclei. James Parkinson, identified a problem with the substantia nigra, a degeneration of the substantia nigra that actually led to the movement disorder known as Parkinson's disease, back in the 19th century. So it became known as the basal ganglia early because, damage to these structures produces very obvious, movement disruptions. And so, that name is stuck. It's in the neurology literature that goes, back over 100 years. So anyway, the substantia nigra, projects into nuclei that are found in the basal ganglia, a subset of the nuclei. Not all the basal ganglia nuclei, receive the axon terminals and, get dopamine released upon their postsynaptic, membranes. It turns out it's a subset, and it's an interesting subset because they actually look striped because there's lots and lots of axons that are coming from the frontal lobe here, from the motor output, the voluntary motor output from the frontal lobe, that sort of like streak through with their white matter, projections some of these nuclei in the basal ganglia. So they give them a striped, or what they call striated appearance. So these nuclei, there's this subset of nuclei in the basal ganglia that receive dopaminergic input from, the brainstem nucleus called the substantia nigra, are known as the striatum. So the striatum is what receives the dopaminergic projections from the brainstem substantia nigra nucleus. And we call this pathway the nigrostriatal pathway. And actually, again, damage to the nigrostriatal pathway, the degeneration. Typically, you got to get over, 70% of those neurons lost, those dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra in the brainstem lost before people start to report like a tremor, slowness of movement, difficulty with initiating movement, all these symptoms that are associated with Parkinson's disease. There's a lot to talk about in terms of Parkinson's disease, and we'll talk about a little bit about this more soon. But the nigrostriatal pathway is a really important central nervous system pathway. That's a dopaminergic pathway that starts in the substantia nigra in the brainstem. That's where the cell bodies are localized. And then the axons project out and make synaptic connection with a subset of nuclei in the basal ganglia that are called the striatum. So it's the nigrostriatal pathway, really important for movement. Degeneration results in, Parkinson's disease. There's another brainstem source of dopaminergic projections in other portions of the brain, and this one's called the ventral tegmental area, also in the midbrain, like the substantia nigra. And the ventral tegmental area, or the VTA, is the source of dopaminergic cell bodies, and then the axons project out, and they form a number of really important pathways for motivated behavior. One of the pathways sort of, derives from the VTA, so it's VTA forward. And actually the VTA, that's, in the mesencephalon, the midbrain region. So they start the names of those pathways with the term meso, because it's coming from the VTA. But they go to limbic structures. And we'll talk about limbic areas of the brain as being really important for emotional experience and expression, including motivated behaviors. So we're going to see that the VTA dopaminergic neurons project into structures like the hypothalamus, and they project into structures like there's a very important structure called the nucleus accumbens in the frontal lobe. So these sort of subcortical targets, basically limbic targets, areas, subcortical areas that are involved in emotional experience and expression, that receive meso input, VTA input, dopaminergic input. This is called the mesolimbic pathway, mesolimbic dopamine pathway. It's initiated, starts in the brainstem, in the mesencephalon, in the midbrain, in the VTA nucleus. And then there are, axonal projections that go out and synapse and release dopamine on cells in the hypothalamus, the nucleus accumbens and other limbic, subcortical targets. And the other kind of pathway that derives from the VTA, dopaminergic pathway, again, starts in the VTA. That's where the cell bodies are located. But then the axons sort of extend out and form connections with areas of the cortex in the frontal lobe. So these are actually called this is the mesocortical pathway, dopaminergic pathway. So think about dopamine being critically involved in movement, aspects of movement, the timing of movement, the initiation of movement, the stopping of movement, and thoughts, we'll see. But then also involved in sort of motivated behavior, which often involves movement. Dopamine release is provoked by things that are novel or unexpected, where you orient, you look around, you sort of are motivated. And also, by stimuli that sort of predict the delivery of some kind of a reward. So, you turn on your coffee maker and then, you're like, you pour it, you're motivated to take all those steps because there's going to be some kind of a reward. So anyway, that's dopamine. And again, we go into far more detail on this neurotransmitter, which is so essential, to motivated behavior and movement, which is a lot of what we do in the psychopharmacology class.